The dust of redemption, Nevada, was a fine, choking powder the color of rust and regret. It coated everything, settling in the creases of worn leather and the lines of weary faces. On the raw timber stage, it settled on the shoulders of the girl, a silent shroud on her silk tunic, now torn and sullied. Her name was Maylene, a name that meant beautiful lotus, whispered once in a garden of soft moonlight and gentle bells a world away. Here, under the brutal glare of the frontier sun, she was not a lotus. She was property, item number 12 on the auctioneer's list, standing between a set of branded cattle and a broken-down freight wagon. The air, thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, cheap whiskey, and livestock, was a physical weight, pressing down on her, trying to extinguish the last flicker of defiance in her dark, almond-shaped eyes. Men stared, their gazes like rough hands, stripping away her dignity layer by layer. They saw a novelty, a delicate porcelain doll to be used and broken. They did not see the scholar's daughter who could paint peonies with a single, graceful stroke, or the young woman whose heart held the memory of her mother's songs like a precious, fragile treasure. They saw only what Jedediah Thorne, the man whose sneer was as sharp as his tailored suit, wanted them to see. A thing for sale. Her hands were bound before her, the rope biting into her wrists, but it was the invisible ropes of fate, cruelty, and misfortune that truly held her captive. She stood as still as stone, a statue of sorrow, her spirit retreating to the one place they could not touch, the quiet, unyielding fortress of her mind. Have you ever felt so lost, so utterly alone, that the world itself seems to fade to a gray, merciless haze? Have you ever faced a moment where all hope seems a fool's dream, a distant star swallowed by an endless night? This is a story about such a moment. It is the story of a soul adrift in a sea of cruelty, and the unlikely harbor she found in the heart of a man who was just as lost as she was. It is a testament to the fact that even in the harshest wilderness, where humanity seems a forgotten language, kindness can bloom like a stubborn wildflower, and love can forge a home in the most desolate of places. So stay with me, and listen to the tale of Maylene and the solitary rancher who saw not a commodity, but a survivor. The auctioneer's voice was a grating rasp, extolling her virtues as if she were a prize mare, pointing out the clean line of her jaw, the unblemished skin, the slender frame that promised obedience. A low murmur of bids began, ugly and guttural. $5. 7. The numbers were meaningless insults. Each one was a nail being driven into the coffin of her future. And then, a different voice cut through the grimy air. It was not loud, but it carried a weight that made other sounds fall away. $3. A hush fell over the crowd. Heads turned. The voice had come from the back, from a man who stood half in shadow, leaning against a support post of the saloon's porch. He was tall and broad, dressed in worn buckskin and denim, his face obscured by the brim of a dusty, sweat-stained hat. He looked like he had been carved from the unforgiving landscape itself, all harsh lines and stoic silence. Jedediah Thorne, who had been enjoying the bidding from his perch on a barrel, straightened up, his face a mask of contemptuous disbelief. $3, the auctioneer scoffed, turning to the stranger. Friend, the bidding is at 12. The man in the shadows did not move. He simply repeated the words, his voice as level and unyielding as a granite slab. $3. It was not a bid. It was a statement. It was an insult so profound, so dismissive of the entire sordid affair, that it stunned the crowd into silence. It declared the girl, and the entire spectacle, to be worth next to nothing. Thorne's face purpled with rage. This was his show, his demonstration of power, but there was something in the stranger's posture, a lethal stillness, that gave even a man like Thorne pause. A ripple of unease went through the onlookers. They were hard men, but they recognized the quiet danger of a man who had nothing left to lose. The stranger pushed himself off the post and took a step into the light. His face was weathered, a roadmap of sun and sorrow, with pale, piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through the grime and posturing. He looked at Thorne, then his gaze shifted to Maylene on the stage. For a fleeting second, their eyes met. She saw no pity there, no lust, but something else entirely, a shared emptiness, a recognition of a soul scarred by the world. The auctioneer, flustered and eager to be done with it, looked at Thorne. Thorne, his jaw tight, gave a curt, angry nod. He would deal with this silent rebuke later. "Sold," the auctioneer cried, slamming his gavel down, "to the strange fella for the ridiculous sum of $3. The man walked forward, the crowd parting before him as if he were a phantom. He tossed 3 silver coins onto the stage. They rang with a clarity that seemed to mock the dirty planks. Without a word, he ascended the steps, drew a knife from his belt, and with a single, clean slice, cut the ropes that bound Maylene's wrists. He didn't touch her. He just stood back and waited, his expression unreadable. Maylene rubbed her raw wrists, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She looked from the terrifying face of Jedediah Thorne to the impassive one of her new owner. She had been bought, sold from one form of damnation to another. As the man turned and gestured for her to follow, she took a shaky breath and did the only thing she could. She obeyed, stepping off the stage and into the shadow of the man who had purchased her life for the price of a cheap meal, her future an unwritten page in the vast, terrifying book of the American West. The journey from the town of redemption was a long, punishing silence. The man, who she would later learn was named Silas Blackwood, moved with the loping, tireless gait of a wolf, his stride eating up the dusty miles. He had untied a single, sturdy horse from the hitching post, a big roan with intelligent eyes, and had simply started walking, leading the animal and expecting her to follow. Maylene trailed a few paces behind him, her thin silk slippers, made for the paved courtyards of her home, shredding on the sharp rocks and thorny scrub. Each step was a fresh agony, but she made no sound. To show weakness, she had learned, was to invite cruelty. So she walked, her focus narrowed to the broad, buckskin-clad back in front of her, a moving wall that blocked out the rest of the world. The sun was a hammer, beating down on the cracked earth. The landscape was a study in browns and grays, a vast, empty canvas stretching to a horizon of jagged, tooth-like mountains that seemed to promise nothing but more hardship. It was a land without mercy, without softness, and she felt a profound, soul-deep terror that she would simply perish here, her body left for the vultures, her story untold. The silence from the man was more unnerving than threats would have been. He didn't speak, didn't look back. He just moved forward with a relentless purpose that was both terrifying and, in a strange way, grounding. He was a force of nature, as elemental and unreadable as the harsh wind that whipped strands of her dark hair across her face. Hours bled into one another. Her feet were screaming, her throat a desert. Just when she thought she could not take another step, that she would collapse into the dust and let the end take her, he stopped. Without a word, he unslung a canteen from his horse and held it out to her. Maylene stared at it, her mind racing. Was it a trick? A test? In her experience, nothing was given freely. But the set of his jaw was not cruel, just weary, and his eyes, when they briefly met hers, held an exhaustion that seemed to match her own. Hesitantly, she reached out and took the canteen. Her hands trembled as she drank, the lukewarm water the most precious thing she had ever tasted. He turned away, affording her a small moment of privacy, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains as if they held some answer only he could see. The narrator knew his thoughts. He was seeing other mountains, the misty, green hills of Virginia, and hearing the echoes of cannon fire. He was remembering the letter that had found him in a field hospital, the one written in his neighbor's careful hand, telling him that the fever had taken his Sarah and their little boy Daniel. He had come west to outrun the ghosts, to find a place so empty it could swallow his grief. He had built his solitude like a fortress, wall by wall, until the silence was all he knew. And now this girl. He hadn't gone to town for a person. He'd gone for salt and flour. But seeing her on that stage, her chin held high amidst the squalor, her stillness a rebuke to the ugliness around her, had struck a chord deep inside him, a rusty, forgotten thing he thought was long dead. It wasn't pity. It was a flicker of honor, the ghost of the man he used to be, the man who defended the helpless. Buying her for $3 was an act of defiance against men like Thorne, men who fed on the weakness of others. It was a reckless, foolish impulse, and now he was walking back to his fortress of solitude with a ghost of his own, a living, breathing one he had no idea what to do with. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple, a structure came into view. It was a small, solid-looking cabin, built of dark, sturdy logs, with a stone chimney breathing a thin plume of smoke into the vast emptiness. A simple corral stood nearby, and a barn that seemed to lean with the wind. This was his home, his sanctuary of sorrow. To Maylene, it looked like the loneliest place on earth, a final outpost before the edge of the world. As they drew closer, Silas finally spoke, his voice rough from disuse. He didn't look at her, but pointed toward the cabin. "You'll be safe there." The words were simple, stark, but for Maylene, who had not known a moment of safety in months, they landed with the force of a revelation. She didn't know if she could believe them, but as she looked at the cabin, nestled in the shadow of the great, silent mountains, a tiny, fragile seed of something that felt perilously like hope began to stir in the barren soil of her heart. She had survived the auction. She had survived the journey. Now, she would have to survive the quiet, and the man who was its keeper. The interior of the cabin was as stark and Spartan as the man himself. It was a single room, dominated by a large stone fireplace, where embers glowed with a welcoming warmth against the encroaching chill of the high desert night. The air smelled of wood smoke, pine, and leather. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs stood in the center. A bed was tucked into one corner, and shelves holding a few books, tins, and tools lined one wall. It was a space built for purpose, not comfort, a testament to a life stripped down to its barest essentials. Maylene stood just inside the doorway, a ghost lingering on a threshold, her eyes taking in every detail. She braced herself for the inevitable, for the moment he would claim his purchase, for the gruff command that would extinguish the last vestiges of herself. She clutched her hands together, her knuckles white, her entire being a coiled spring of dread. But the command never came. Instead, Silas moved past her, his presence filling the small space. He gestured not to the bed in the corner, but to a small alcove near the fireplace. A simple cot had been set up there, with a clean, folded blanket and a pillow. It was separate, a space cordoned off, an island of privacy in the small room. He then pointed to a bucket of water and a clean cloth on a small stand. His gaze was direct, meeting hers for only a moment before shifting away. "The room is small," he said, the words seeming to cost him some great effort. "This is yours." He turned and walked back outside, leaving her alone in the sudden, echoing silence. Maylene stood frozen, the man's words replaying in her mind. "This is yours." The concept was so foreign, so utterly alien to her current reality, that she could barely process it. For months, nothing had been hers. Not her body, not her time, not even the direction of her own gaze. To be given a space, however small, was an act of grace so unexpected it felt like a trick of the light. Slowly, cautiously, as if moving in a dream, she approached the alcove. She touched the rough wool of the blanket. It was real. This small corner was a sanctuary. She did not know what this man wanted, what his game was, but for tonight, she was not a slave in a corner, but a person with a place. The exhaustion of the day, of the past months, washed over her in a great, crushing wave. She used the cloth and water to wash the grime from her face and hands, the simple act of reclamation of herself. Then, she lay down on the cot, fully clothed, and pulled the blanket up to her chin. Sleep did not come easily. The cabin creaked and groaned around her, the wind howling a lonely song outside. She could hear Silas moving about, the quiet sounds of a man settling in for the night, the clink of a cup, the scrape of a boot, the soft thud of a log being added to the fire. Every sound was a potential threat, yet nothing happened. He remained on the other side of the room, a silent, brooding presence. The narrator watched them both, 2 solitary souls under one roof, separated by a chasm of culture, language, and pain. Silas sat at his table, a cup of bitter coffee in his hands, staring into the fire. He was acutely aware of her presence, of the soft sound of her breathing. His carefully constructed solitude had been breached, and the silence was no longer empty, but filled with a new, fragile tension. He thought of his wife, Sarah, of the way she had filled this cabin with light and laughter. He had built it for her, for their future. After she and Daniel were gone, it had become a tomb, a monument to his failure to protect them. He had never imagined another woman sleeping under its roof. This girl, Maylene, was a complication he had not foreseen. He had acted on an old, buried instinct for justice, but he had no plan for what came next. He could not keep her here forever, a prisoner of his protection. The world outside, the world of men like Thorne, was a danger to her. But what life could she have here, with him, a broken man in the middle of nowhere? For the first time in years, Silas felt a flicker of something other than grief or a numb routine. It was a sharp, uncomfortable feeling, responsibility. Across the room, Maylene's fear slowly began to recede, replaced by a profound and weary confusion. This man was not like the others. He had not hurt her, had not touched her, had not even looked at her with the familiar, possessive hunger she had come to expect. He had given her water, a place to sleep, and a quiet dignity she thought she had lost forever. Why? The question echoed in the silent chambers of her heart. She did not know the answer, and this uncertainty was its own kind of fear. But as the fire crackled and the warmth seeped into her bones, another feeling surfaced, faint but persistent. It was a sense of safety, something she had not felt since the day she was torn from her home. Here, in this rough cabin with this silent, wounded man, the monsters felt, for the first time, a little farther away. She finally drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep, the first she had known in a very long time, unaware that the man across the room sat awake long into the night, guarding her slumber like a sentinel. The days that followed settled into a rhythm of quiet observation and shared solitude. Life on the ranch was dictated by the sun and the seasons, a relentless cycle of hard, physical labor. Silas rose before dawn, his movements economical and precise, and worked until dusk. He mended fences that stretched for miles, tended to a small herd of cattle, chopped wood, and hunted for game. He moved with a grim determination, as if trying to physically exhaust the ghosts that haunted him. Maylene watched him from the cabin, a silent observer of his lonely world. In the beginning, she did little, paralyzed by fear and uncertainty. She stayed in her corner, making herself as small and unobtrusive as possible, expecting that at any moment the fragile peace would be shattered. But Silas demanded nothing of her. He would leave food for her on the table, a plate of smoked meat and hard biscuits, or a bowl of thin stew, before he left for the day. He never forced her to eat with him, never spoke unless absolutely necessary. Their communication was a sparse language of gestures and single words. Water, food, coal. It was the language of survival, stripped of all pleasantries. Yet in its directness, there was a strange kind of honesty. Slowly, cautiously, Maylene began to emerge from her shell. She was not made for idleness. The daughter of a scholar, she was also the granddaughter of farmers, and the rhythms of a household were ingrained in her. She began by cleaning the cabin, sweeping the floor with a makeshift broom, wiping the dust from the shelves. It was a small act, but it was a way of imposing order on the chaos of her life, of claiming a role for herself that was not victim or prisoner. Silas noticed. He came in one evening, exhausted and covered in dust, and stopped, his eyes scanning the tidy room. He said nothing, but he left a small, brightly colored wildflower on the table the next morning before he left. Maylene found it when she woke, a spot of impossible, vibrant blue against the rough, gray wood. She picked it up, her fingers tracing its delicate petals. It was the first beautiful thing she had been given in a year, a small, silent acknowledgement. She found a chipped cup and put the flower in water, placing it in the center of the table, a tiny beacon of life in the Spartan room. A silent conversation had begun between them. She started mending his clothes, her stitches neat and even, a skill her mother had taught her. He, in turn, began leaving a portion of his meager coffee rations for her in the mornings. She took over the cooking, transforming his bland, functional meals into something more. She found wild herbs growing near the creek that ran behind the cabin, recognizing them from the drawings in her father's books. She added them to the stews, filling the cabin with new, savory aromas. One evening, Silas came in to find a bowl of stew that tasted not just of sustenance, but of care. He looked at her, a question in his eyes. She simply nodded toward the pot, a flicker of a smile touching her lips for the first time. It was a fragile, fleeting thing, but it transformed her face, giving him a glimpse of the person she was before the world had tried to break her. This was the slow burn of trust, forged not in grand declarations, but in the crucible of shared daily existence. It was built in the quiet moments, the way she would have a fire going for him when he returned, cold and weary, the way he started leaving a bucket of fresh water for her inside the cabin door, so she wouldn't have to go out to the well. It was in the shared silence that was no longer tense and fearful, but comfortable and companionable. One afternoon, a sudden, violent blizzard swept down from the mountains, trapping them inside the cabin for 2 days. The world outside disappeared into a swirling vortex of white. The wind shrieked like a banshee, rattling the very bones of the cabin. They were forced into close proximity, the small room shrinking around them. It was during this enforced intimacy that a true shift occurred. Silas was cleaning his rifle by the firelight, his hands moving with practiced ease. Maylene was grinding corn for bread. The silence was broken only by the howl of the wind and the crackle of the fire. "Why?" The word was soft, barely a whisper, but in the quiet of the cabin, it was as loud as a gunshot. Silas stopped his work, his hand stilling on the rifle. He looked at her. "Why did you help me?" she asked again, her English careful and deliberate. She had been practicing the words in her head for weeks. Silas set the rifle down. He stared into the fire for a long time, the flames dancing in his pale eyes. He was not a man of many words, and the ones he had were locked away with his grief. "I saw," he started, his voice a low rumble. He stopped, searching for the right words. "Men like Thorn," he finally said, his voice hard as iron. "They poison everything they touch. The world has enough poison." He looked at her then, his gaze direct and unwavering. No one should be for sale. It was the most he had ever said to her. In those few sentences, she understood. It wasn't about her, not really. It was about him, about the code of honor that lived in him, buried but not dead. It was about his own war against the ugliness of the world. And in that moment, she realized she was not just a burden he had taken on, but a cause. She was his stand against the poison. The storm raged outside, but inside the small log cabin, something had broken open between them. The wall of his solitude had been breached, not by force, but by a quiet persistence, a shared humanity. And for Maylene, the seed of hope that had been planted on her first night began to send out a tentative, fragile root, seeking purchase in the heart of this broken, honorable man. The thaw came, both in the landscape and in the small cabin. The blizzard receded, leaving behind a world scrubbed clean and dazzlingly white under a sharp blue sky. The air was crisp and cold, but it held the promise of spring. Inside, the quiet between Silas and Maylene was different now. The confession born of the storm had changed the emotional geography of their shared space. The silence was less about what was unsaid and more about what was mutually understood. They were allies, two survivors adrift on the same small raft in a vast, indifferent ocean. Their partnership, forged in shared chores, deepened. He began to speak to her more, not in long conversations, but in small observations about the land, the weather, the animals. He would point out the tracks of a deer in the snow, or the circling hawk high above. "That one's a red-tail," he'd say. "Good hunter." It was his way of sharing his world with her, of letting her in. Maylene, in turn, found ways to share hers. One evening, she took a piece of charcoal from the fire and, on a smooth piece of scrap lumber, she began to draw. Her hand moved with a grace and confidence that surprised Silas. She drew the mountains that framed the valley, the sturdy cabin, the lone pine tree that stood sentinel on the ridge. Then, she drew a lotus flower, its petals unfolding with exquisite detail. Silas watched, mesmerized. It was like watching a language he didn't know being spoken fluently. When she was done, she looked at him and pointed to the flower. "Maylene," she said softly. Her name. He understood. It was a piece of her soul, a memory of the beauty she came from. It was a declaration that she was more than the broken creature he had found in redemption. She was a lotus flower, capable of blooming even in the muddiest of waters. In that moment he saw her, truly saw her, for the first time, not as a responsibility or a symbol of his defiance, but as a person of profound strength and quiet artistry. He felt a deep, aching pang in his chest, a feeling he had long since buried with his wife and son. It was a dangerous feeling, one he had sworn off forever, but it was there nonetheless, a warmth spreading through his frozen heart. His protection of her began to shift from a sense of duty to something fiercely personal. He started teaching her things, practical things for survival in this land. He showed her how to read the clouds, how to find clean water, how to set a snare. It was his way of giving her power, of giving her agency. One day, he took her to a place he had never shown anyone else. It was a small, sheltered meadow, high up on the ridge behind the cabin. In the spring, it was carpeted with wildflowers. A small, clear stream tumbled over smooth rocks. It was a place of breathtaking, secret beauty. This was, he began, his voice thick with emotion. This was Sarah's place, my wife's. He had never spoken her name aloud to Maylene before. He stood there, his back to her, a great, silent monument of grief. We were going to build a new house here, a bigger one, for Daniel. The name of his son was a ghost on the air. Maylene felt his pain as if it were her own. She knew the shape of loss, the weight of a stolen future. She didn't speak. Words were useless against such a sorrow. Instead, she walked to the stream and gathered a handful of smooth, white stones. She returned to where he stood, and one by one, she began to place them on a large, flat rock, building a small, simple cairn, a marker of remembrance. It was an ancient gesture from her own culture, a way of honoring the spirits of the departed. Silas turned and watched her small hands moving with such gentle purpose. He saw her honoring his grief, sharing its weight without trying to erase it. When she was finished, she stepped back, her head bowed for a moment. He looked from the simple stone memorial to her face, and saw in her eyes a deep, profound empathy that went beyond language. He had brought her to his most sacred place of sorrow, and she had transformed it into a place of shared remembrance. He realized then that she was not a ghost in his tomb. She was a light. She was not reopening old wounds, but showing him that it was possible to live with the scars. The connection between them was no longer just about survival or alliance. It was becoming something deeper, more intricate, a slow, quiet weaving of two broken threads into a single, stronger cord. He had saved her from the auction block, but she, in her quiet, resilient way, was saving him from the prison of his past. The ranch was no longer just his sanctuary of solitude. It was becoming their shared home. The fragile peace they had so carefully constructed was shattered by the drumming of a horse's hooves. It was a hot, still afternoon, the kind where the air itself seems to hold its breath. Silas was splitting logs, the rhythmic thud of his axe the only sound in the valley. Maylene was tending to a small, fledgling garden she had started near the cabin, coaxing green shoots from the stubborn soil. The sound came suddenly, an alien intrusion on their quiet world. Silas froze, his axe held mid-swing. He turned his head, his eyes narrowed, scanning the long, winding trail that led from the valley floor. A lone rider was approaching, moving at a steady, confident pace. It was not the meandering pace of a lost traveler. This was a man with a destination. Maylene, Silas said, his voice a low, urgent command. Inside. Now. There was no question in her eyes, only a sudden, cold fear that mirrored his own. She dropped her trowel and ran for the cabin, her heart pounding. Silas drove the axe into the chopping block and strode to where his rifle leaned against the cabin wall. He checked the load, his movements swift and sure. The years of solitude had not dulled the instincts of the soldier he once was. He stood on the porch, the rifle held loosely in his hands, and waited. The rider drew closer, revealing himself to be a lean, hard-faced man with a cruel twist to his mouth and a pistol holstered low on his hip. He reined in his horse a respectful distance from the cabin, his eyes taking in the scene, The solitary man, the rifle, the tense stillness in the air. He was a wolf testing the scent on the wind. "Howdy," the rider said, his voice a lazy drawl that didn't match the predatory alertness in his eyes. "Looking for a man named Blackwood." "You found him," Silas replied, his voice flat and unwelcoming. "State your business." The rider's gaze flickered to the cabin door, a knowing smirk playing on his lips. "My employer, Mr. Jedediah Thorne, sends his regards. He's a man who likes to keep track of his investments." The word investments hung in the air, a deliberate and venomous insult. Silas's grip tightened on the rifle stock. The blood roared in his ears, a familiar battle hum he had not heard in years. He thought of Maylene inside the cabin, of the fragile trust they had built, of the drawing of the lotus flower. A cold, protective rage, purer and hotter than any fire, surged through him. "There's no investment here," Silas said, his voice dangerously quiet. "What I bought I own, and what I own I protect." The rider chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Mr. Thorne doesn't see it that way. He paid a fair price to bring the girl over from San Francisco. He considers the $3 you paid an insult, not a sale. He sees it as a temporary loan. He's a generous man. He's willing to buy her back. $50. A fair profit for you." The offer was a test, a way to gauge Silas's character. Was he a man of principle, or just another opportunist? Silas's answer was not in words. He simply raised the rifle until it was leveled directly at the rider's chest. The lazy confidence drained from the man's face, replaced by a sudden, sharp wariness. He was looking into the eyes of a man who was not negotiating. "You can ride back to Thorne," Silas said, his voice as cold and hard as the barrel of his gun. "You can tell him this is my land. The girl is under my protection. If he or any of his men set foot in this valley again, I'll plant them where they stand. That's my only offer." Inside the cabin, Maylene listened, her hands pressed against the rough log wall. She could not understand all the words, but she understood the tone. She understood the shift in Silas's voice from quiet command to deadly threat. She had heard that tone from men before, but it had always been directed at her. Now, for the first time, it was being used to defend her. She peeked through a small crack in the door, just enough to see the standoff. She saw Silas, standing tall and unmovable, a lone bastion against the encroaching darkness. He was no longer just a quiet, wounded man who shared his food and his silence. He was a protector, a warrior, standing between her and the hell she had escaped. The rider, seeing the utter lack of fear or hesitation in Silas's eyes, made his decision. He was a hired gun, not a martyr. He slowly raised his hands in a gesture of mock surrender. "No need for trouble, friend," he drawled, backing his horse away. "Just delivering a message." He wheeled his horse around and spurted back down the trail, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. Silas didn't lower the rifle until the rider was a small speck in the distance. The silence that descended was heavier, more fraught with peril, than any before it. The shadow of Jedediah Thorne had fallen across their sanctuary. The peace was broken. The outside world, with all its poison and greed, had found them. The coming storm was no longer a matter of if, but when. The departure of Thorne's man did not restore the peace. It murdered it. The quiet of the valley now felt different, charged with a tense, waiting energy. Every gust of wind sounded like an approaching rider. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. The sanctuary had become a potential battlefield. The slow, gentle rhythm of their life was replaced by a grim, shared purpose. The unspoken alliance had been declared openly, and now they had to prepare for the war that was coming. Silas was transformed. The quiet, grieving rancher receded, and the soldier he had been took his place. His movements became even more efficient, his eyes constantly scanning the ridges that surrounded the cabin. He spent the next days fortifying their small fortress. He reinforced the cabin door, barred the windows, and cleared brush from around the cabin to create a clear field of fire. He was no longer just tending a ranch. He was preparing a defensive position. But the most significant change was not in what he did for her, but in what he did with her. He knew he could not protect her alone if Thorne came in force. He had to empower her. He had to turn the resilient survivor into a fighter. One morning, he took down a second rifle from its pegs above the fireplace. It was smaller, lighter than his own. It had been Sarah's. She had been a good shot, unafraid of the wilderness. The memory was a sharp pang, but he pushed it down. This was about survival now. He took Maylene out to the corral and set up a line of empty tins on a fence post. He handed her the rifle. She looked at the weapon, then at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. In her world, women did not handle such things. They were instruments of violence, the tools of men who caused pain. Silas's voice was patient, but firm. Thorn will not come alone next time. I might not be enough. You need to know how to use this. You need to be able to protect yourself. He showed her how to hold it, how to brace it against her shoulder. He showed her how to sight down the barrel, how to gently squeeze the trigger, not pull it. His hands guided hers, his touch impersonal and instructional, yet it was the most profound physical contact they had ever shared. It was a transfer of knowledge, of power. The first time she fired, the recoil knocked her back a step, and the loud crack made her flinch. The shot went wide, kicking up dust far from the targets. She looked at the rifle with frustration and fear. But Silas was patient. Again, he said simply. Day after day, they practiced. He was a demanding teacher, but a fair one. He praised her progress with a quiet nod, and corrected her mistakes with a calm, steady hand. Slowly, her fear of the weapon was replaced by a growing competence. Her shots became truer, her stance more solid. She was no longer just a scholar's daughter who could paint a lotus. She was a woman who could hit a tin can from 50 yards. This was the pivotal moment in her transformation. She was not a damsel waiting for rescue. She was becoming a partner in her own defense. The act of learning to fight, of holding her own power in her hands, was a profound reclamation of her agency. She was forging a new identity here, in this harsh and beautiful land, an identity defined not by her victimhood, but by her strength. During this time, the emotional walls between them crumbled completely. They worked as a team, their movements synchronized, their purpose unified. They spoke more freely, sharing plans, fears, and hopes in the quiet evenings. He told her stories of the war, not of the glory, but of the strategy, the waiting, the terror. She, in turn, told him more about her home, painting pictures with her words of a life of learning and family, a life that Thorn had stolen. Their bond was no longer a fragile, unspoken thing. It was a hardened alliance, forged in the fire of a shared threat. They were two soldiers in a lonely outpost, watching the horizon, waiting for the enemy. One evening, as they sat by the fire cleaning their weapons, a comfortable silence between them, Maylene paused. "Silas," she said, her voice clear and strong, "I am not afraid." He looked up, surprised. He saw the truth of it in her eyes. The fear was gone, replaced by a calm, steely resolve. "He will not take me again," she continued. "This is my home now. I will fight for it." Silas felt a surge of pride so fierce it almost stole his breath. This was the woman he had seen on the auction block, the one with the unyielding spirit hidden beneath the fear. He had not given her the strength. He had only given her the tools to unleash it. He reached across the small space between them and gently touched her hand. It was a simple gesture, but it was filled with respect, with admiration, with a depth of feeling that went far beyond words. "I know," he said, his voice husky, "and you will not fight alone." They were ready. Let Thorn come. Let him bring his poison and his hired guns. They would find not a broken man and a frightened girl, but a fortress defended by two warriors, bound by honor and a love they had not yet dared to name. The storm broke on a day when the sky was a perfect, cloudless blue. The air was still, heavy with the scent of pine and dust. It came not as a distant rumble, but as an abrupt, violent tear in the fabric of their peace. Silas was on the ridge, his spyglass to his eye, when he saw them, a dark centipede of riders, at least a dozen men, kicking up a plume of dust as they snaked their way into his valley. At their head rode Jedediah Thorn, his fine city clothes an obscene blot on the natural landscape. Silas's heart didn't race. It settled into a cold, steady beat. The waiting was over. He scrambled down the ridge, his long strides eating up the ground. "They're here!" he yelled as he approached the cabin. Maylene was already at the door, her face pale, but her eyes resolute. She held her rifle, the one that had once been Sarah's, with a steady grip. There was no time for words, no time for fear. They moved to their prepared positions, like two parts of a single, well-oiled machine. Silas took up a spot at the front window, which offered a commanding view of the trail. Maylene moved to a smaller window on the side, covering the flank. The cabin, their home, became their redoubt. The riders fanned out as they approached, forming a loose, menacing semicircle around the cabin. Thorn reined in his horse, just out of easy rifle range, his face a mask of smug arrogance. He believed this was a simple transaction, a matter of overwhelming force. He had come to collect his property, Blackwood. Thorn's voice was amplified by the unnatural quiet of the valley. "You've had your fun. I've been patient, but my patience has its limits. Send out the girl, and I'll let you live. Refuse, and I'll burn this pathetic shack to the ground with you inside it." Silas rested his cheek against the cool wood of his rifle stock. He sighted on one of the riders, a hulking man with a sneer, and squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle shot was a definitive answer. The rider cried out and tumbled from his saddle, clutching a wounded shoulder. Chaos erupted. The riders scattered for cover, returning fire. Bullets thudded into the thick log walls of the cabin, splintering wood, filling the air with the sharp scent of gunpowder. The siege had begun. Inside, Silas and Maylene were a whirlwind of focused action. They moved from window to window, firing carefully aimed shots, making every bullet count. "Left side, by the rocks," Silas called out, and a moment later, the crack of Maylene's rifle answered, followed by a curse from outside. She was a natural, her movements fluid and calm under fire. The girl who had once been terrified of a raised voice was now holding her own against a dozen armed men. She was not fighting for Silas. She was fighting for herself, for her home, for the future she was determined to claim. The hours dragged on. The sun beat down. The air inside the cabin grew thick with smoke and the metallic tang of spent cartridges. They were outnumbered, and Thorn's men were slowly, methodically closing in. A thrown torch landed on the roof, and smoke began to seep through the ceiling. "The roof's on fire," Maylene cried, her voice tight, but not panicked. Silas knew they couldn't stay inside. They would be cooked alive. "We have to move," he said, his mind racing. "The barn. It's our only chance." He outlined a desperate plan. He would lay down covering fire from the front, drawing their attention, while she slipped out the back and made a run for the barn. Once there, she could fire on Thorn's men from a new angle, catching them in a crossfire. It was a suicidal risk for them both. "I will not leave you," she said, her dark eyes flashing. "We are in this together," he countered, grabbing her shoulders, his gaze intense. "This is the only way we both survive. Trust me." In his eyes, she saw not a commander giving an order, but a partner asking for faith. She nodded, her jaw set. He loaded his last few rounds into his rifle. "On my count," he said. 3, 2, 1. Go." He unleashed a volley of rapid fire from the front window, the shots echoing like thunder. The men outside scrambled, focusing their attention on him. In that moment of distraction, Maylene slipped out the back door, a fleeting shadow against the bright sunlight. She ran, her breath tearing at her lungs, the ground seeming to fly beneath her feet. Bullets whizzed past her, but she did not falter. She reached the relative safety of the barn, her heart a wild drum. The battle shifted. Now caught between 2 points of fire, Thorn's men were thrown into confusion. Their superior numbers were negated by the superior strategy and the unyielding spirit of the cabin's defenders. Silas saw his chance. Thorn, in his arrogance, had remained on his horse, directing his men, believing himself untouchable. As his men fell into disarray, Silas took a deep breath, aimed his rifle, and fired. The shot was perfect. Thorn cried out, not in pain, but in shock, as he was thrown from his horse, his leg shattered. The fight went out of his men. Seeing their leader down, their ranks thinned, they lost their nerve. One by one, they broke and fled, leaving their wounded and their vanquished employer in the dust. A profound silence fell over the valley, broken only by the crackle of the flames on the cabin roof and the pained groans of Jedediah Thorne. Silas staggered out of the cabin, his body bruised, his ears ringing. He saw Maylene emerge from the barn, her rifle still in her hand. They walked toward each other, meeting in the space between the burning cabin and the barn. They had won. Battered, exhausted, their home in flames, but they had won. The smoke from the smoldering cabin roof rose in a thin, gray pillar against the setting sun, a funeral pyre for the life they had known. The silence that followed the frantic chaos of the battle was vast and heavy, filled with the ghosts of what had just happened. Jedediah Thorne lay in the dust, his leg mangled, his arrogance shattered. The few of his men who remained wounded were moaning, their fight long gone. Silas stood over Thorne, his rifle held loosely, his face a grim mask of exhaustion. Thorne looked up at him, his expression a mixture of pain and disbelief. You'll hang for this." Thorne spat, clutching his leg. Silas looked down at the man who represented everything he despised: greed, cruelty, the belief that people were objects to be owned. "No," Silas said, his voice weary but firm. "I'm not a murderer, but your time in this valley is over." He left Thorne there for his remaining men to deal with, a broken tyrant in the dust of his own failed conquest. He turned and walked toward Maylene, who was standing near the well, her face smudged with soot, her eyes wide with the aftershock of battle. Her strength had not faltered during the fight, but now a tremor ran through her. She had taken part in violence, had fought for her life, and the weight of it was settling upon her. Silas came to a stop in front of her. He looked at the smoking ruins of his home, the place he had built for a future that had died, and now it had been destroyed, protecting a future he had never dared to imagine. He looked at her, at the woman who had fought beside him, who had stood her ground, who had become his partner in the truest sense of the word. All the unspoken feelings, all the emotions held back by grief and caution, rose to the surface. "The cabin," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly as she looked at the wreckage. "It is gone." "It was just wood and stone," Silas replied, his gaze never leaving her face. "We are safe. That is all that matters." He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before he gently brushed a smudge of soot from her cheek. It was a gesture of such tenderness it seemed to breach the last defense around her heart. "You were brave, Maylene," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "Braver than anyone I have ever known." Tears welled in her eyes, not of fear or sorrow, but of overwhelming relief and a profound, burgeoning joy. "You taught me to be," she whispered. In the quiet aftermath of the storm, with the smell of smoke in the air and the world stripped down to its essential truths, there was nothing left to hide behind. The pretense of owner and ward, of protector and protected, had been burned away in the firefight. They were simply a man and a woman who had saved each other. Silas knew what he had to do. He had fought to protect her freedom, and now he had to truly give it to her. He went into the still intact barn, to a small, hidden lockbox where he kept his important papers. He returned with a piece of paper, the deed to the ranch. He also had a small pouch of coins, all the money he had in the world. He held them out to her. "This is yours," he said, "the deed to this land. Thorne,